Welcome back, Time Crunch fans. I'm your host, Coach Adam Pulford. Today's topic is cross-training, but it's not the cross-training that you're probably thinking of. Specifically, we'll be talking about training methods for cyclocross, aka cross, as the cool kids say. I brought in our cyclocross resident expert and cool kid himself, CTS Premier Coach, Jim Lehman. Jim, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Adam. And I appreciate you clarifying that it's not just cross training, because I would definitely be out of my element a little bit there.
That's true. You're not one to get into the gym and bend some metal, are you?
That's been a while. It's been a while.
Yeah. Well, folks, for you, our audience, you may have heard Jim on some previous episodes where we're talking about anything from Paralympics to how to structure a good training camp, best recovery modalities, and things like that. But now we got him back on the show to talk about another specialized area that he has carved a niche for, and that's cyclocross. So, Jim, tell us why you're so passionate about a sport that athletes are basically just racing around in circles on the grass and experiencing anything from 95 degrees with humidity to 10 degrees and snowing. You shoulder a bike and run with it for a while. Muddy courses and heckling are like the spirit of this goofy non-Olympic sport. Why the heck are you into it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I probably got into it a little bit when I was racing. It became a fun way to sort of pass the time in the winter for us. We're living in Flagstaff. The weather wasn't always predictable in the wintertime, but it was a way to get out and do something, stay fit, do a little bit of racing, and just combine the road fitness from the summer and some of the mountain bike skills that we got from the trails around Flagstaff. And then as I got involved in CTS, I started working with a few athletes that were more cyclocross specific. And then I really started to appreciate that side of the sport as well. You know, from a coaching standpoint, it's one of the few disciplines within cycling where the athlete can really be in control of their destiny. They're not on a road program. They may have another job to do for the team. It's really oftentimes the fastest and the most skilled rider that wins, which is really cool to see. And you can see the progress within the course of the season with your athletes too.
Yeah. So you're saying that, like, from a team tactics standpoint, there's not a ton of that aspect that goes into it.
Occasionally you'll see a little bit of it happen, maybe at the World Championships or, during a World Cup where you might have a couple athletes from the same team. But at the end of the day, they're not going to not race each other. They might use some tactics where they might set each other up with an attack and let somebody else cover that and then counterattack that. But generally speaking, it's a little bit like running, where the fastest person, the strongest person typically wins. Again, probably a theme we talk about, you still have to have skills, right? So just the engine isn't going to cut it in cyclocross.
Yep. Yes, exactly. And that's, we'll talk about that on today's episode because that's a huge, huge aspect of cyclocross. But, kudos to our audience members for queuing this one up, because really we got a great question coming in from you, our listeners, and Peter in particular. And so I'll read that question, and then Jim and I will get into this topical discussion, which I should say this is going to be a part 1 of a part 2 series, all focused on cyclocross training. So here's the question. Starts with a statement, though. It would be great if you could present a discussion about how to structure a season where the main focus in racing is cross in September through December. So much of training discussions here and on other pods are focused more traditional road racing and now like gravel racing seasons. And there's little discussion of cross. And I understand, since road and more so gravel is where the bike industry has shifted, that's why that is. But I know I would personally enjoy digging into the areas of cyclocross and feel that this would have some general appeal. So Peter, yeah, I agree with you. So this is going to be super fun. I'm glad we've got the man for the job in Jim Lehman.
Well, yeah, great question, Peter. And I appreciate it too, because this has been, a big part of my coaching career is working with cyclocross specific athletes. So, and I do agree, gravel has been great. It's been great for the sport, but cyclocross, at least in the US, has kind of slipped back a little bit in terms of priority of time and focus and energy. So, but it's still out there. It's still thriving in its own little way. but it's just maybe gone, down a notch from where it was, even 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, that's true. And it's wildly popular worldwide as well. I'd say in the States slipped a little bit, but whenever I started working at CTS, it was like every elite athlete that came to us was either working with Jim, maybe Dean a little bit and tell us, but it was like Jim Lehman, cyclocross question, come over here, that kind of thing. So I think too, like Jim's got the street cred when it comes to answering a lot of these questions. So cue it over to you, Jim. Walk us through just like high level what a normal periodization model could look like for an athlete who's focused on like U.S. national based national championships. Consider them like a master's level racer, and talk about like the transition base build race sort of season, or the way that you would kind of shape it up for your athlete.
Sure. And in the U.S., in most countries, national championships are typically in January. Ours is switched back to December. So it's typically that first weekend. I think this year it's December 3rd through the 10th is the whole sort of national championship week. So if you kind of work forward from there, say from last year, you would finish your season effectively in early December, mid-December. Like most athletes, you'd want to take some kind of a break, some kind of a transition period. And a lot of that will depend on what your season looked like prior and how things went. And, a lot of times it can be more about a mental break than a physical break for a lot of athletes. The training load for a typical masters athlete isn't so great that there's such a physical load, but it's more of the mental stress and the focus that they've put in over that previous season that they just need a little bit of a break, a transition and that could be anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, maybe even 6 weeks for some. I don't think of that as time off the bike. Maybe initially there's a week, 10 days where they might not touch the bike, but they might do some other activities, hiking, running, swimming, some other things. But, really using sort of their guide and their enthusiasm level and their subjective feedback to say, okay, now I think it's time. Let's start getting back on the bike. And that transition period would be kind of the reintroduction to the bike again, where we're now sort of into January, where we're back to riding 3, 4, 5, ultimately 6 days a week, depending on the person's workload. And that would take us around the corner into the following year. So now we're looking at February, March. We're kind of in that base period of time. And base for cyclocross looks a lot like it does for, I would say, any other season. It just sort of takes place at a different time of the year. Because where everybody else, typically, if your summer race season stopped at the end of August or early September, you're kind of doing that transition phase in October, November, whereas a cyclocross specific athlete is doing it more in December and into January. So as we come into that base period, it's, the idea of putting in a little bit more miles, maybe starting to think about increasing the volume over the course of that base period, adding a little bit of, maybe tempo or sweet spot work, but gradually building that back up, and then transitioning from there. And that could, again, really, I'll use this phrase a lot, but it really just kind of depends on the person, how long that lasts, their history in the sport, what their needs are. But that maybe puts us between February and April as we're starting to get through that base phase. And then we go into what would be, more of a general just build phase, where we're starting to do that, maybe more like May through August. We are starting to add a little bit more tempo, a little bit more threshold, sort of lengthen those rides out a little bit, increase the weekly volume. And as you get closer to the end of that build phase is when you get a little bit more cross specific as you sort of get closer to that the race phase, which would be more like September through ultimately December 10th-ish, again, depending on when the national championships are the following season.
Yeah. Great. I think from a time course standpoint, just to kind of recap what Jim was saying is transition phase, really important. And that's coming after national championships for US riders, mid-December, for 4 to 6-ish weeks. And then mid-January, February, start the base. In May, start your build. And then September, cross is here, cross is racing. So one quick question, Jim, to the transition phase, because I think that this is actually really important. It's something that we've talked about several times just in like coaching mentorship and stuff. But transition phase, you said you let the athlete dictate
Right.
when they come back to it, right? So maybe like a week off, but like what are some of the cues that you're looking at in the athlete when they're taking a true break? Like what are you listening to? What are you looking at for indicators that it's time and it's like a good time for them to come back to the bike?
Usually that's, great. And it's hard to really, I believe it's hard to quantify that. And, you know, a lot of times with the technology we have and, you know, again, conversations we've had before, like where I'm older. We did a lot of this stuff initially, whether it was with training or even initial coaching, without a lot of data. So we relied a lot on RPE. We relied a lot on conversations with athletes. And that's where you push the athletes, because I think some of these, you know, I would say newer athletes, either younger athletes who are new to the sport, or even some athletes that aren't necessarily young, but they're young cyclists in the sense that they're newer to the sport, have become so accustomed to looking for a number to tell them, okay, it's time. This number, whatever it is, TSB, CTL, this is the number. I achieved this number. Now I'm ready. And that not necessarily a bad starting point or a bad data point to look at, but I think for this is so important that the athlete really is involved in the process, and you're pushing them to be very in tune with how they're feeling, how they're sleeping, what their energy levels are like. And ultimately, most of them know. They'll wake up one morning and say, I'm ready. I've missed this. I want to do this. And you know, a week prior, even a few days prior, they might wake up and go, I'll ride today, but the fire isn't there. I'm not burning to do this thing. So I think during that transition phase, regular and consistent communication, particularly on the phone or in person if you live near the athlete, because that's when you hear it in their voice, you'll often know too, especially if you're familiar with the athlete. You'll hear it in their voice where they are excited about it again. They're looking forward to riding. So that's why I say I rely on the athlete to tell me when they're ready. I mean, if you start getting to the end of 6 weeks and they're still saying, I'm not sure I'm ready, then maybe you have to look for something else, or you might need to do a little bit of pushing to figure out why after 6 weeks, what's going on, right? What's keeping you from wanting to do this?
Yeah, exactly. Because, you know, there's a lot of art with science that's going on here in coaching. I don't think that you can ever separate any of them. And I would say when you're talking about the stress, you're trying to slough off the stress. You're trying to like get rid of some of that stress that's been built up the whole season long in that transition period. And there's no monitor, there's no meter to tell you how much you have built up or gotten rid of. So that's what we're talking about there. But to the numbers and to the science and to some of the stuff that we track, I'd say let's take some of that science, weave it with the art, and talk about how you would structure some of your base, build, and race phases, just like on a high level. So let's first start with a base phase. We're talking about, this is kind of the February to April time period. What sort of weekly volumes are you aiming for, let's just say, again, master's level athlete as they're ramping up their fitness? And are you looking at ramp rates or a CTL number to indicate something? Or what are you prescribing and looking at?
Yeah, great. You know, I do a little bit of probably right down the middle of that, right? Of using the CTL, but also just sometimes just looking at purely at numbers of what's the progression. And I don't think there's a, 10% per week progression that you follow. A lot of it just depends on, and as with a lot of masters athletes, you're working with a finite window in their day, in their week anyway. So even if you wanted to say, okay, we're going to do 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, 14 hours, you might not be able to do that anyway. So, we've talked about this before, right? So then you're looking at not necessarily increasing the total volume, but what can we do to increase maybe the volume of intensity within that finite number of hours that they have? So then looking to put more quality into that training schedule. But I would say for most of them, if they can do 8 to 10 hours a week, that's great. Because during the week, they're probably pretty limited on what they can accomplish. On the weekends, a little bit more flexibility. And, I would say the one great thing about cross is instead of doing this base period in October, November, December, January. You're doing it February through April. So typically you've turned the corner on winter. So the days are warmer, the days are longer. It makes it a little bit easier, honestly, to have that base period from a cross season, because you're kind of going into the better weather as opposed to trying to do all those long days when the weather may not be as nice, depending on where you live.
Yeah. For most North American athletes, I completely agree with you. And for that base period, one thing just on volume, I think, without getting in the weeds of some of these training stress markers and stuff, but you're kind of speaking to weekly volume and total volume. I'd say for curious athletes, my top masters riders, they're doing about 500 hours a year, which is about 10 hours a week if you take a couple weeks off. Right. Yeah. And I think that that's completely appropriate, completely adequate, and completely realistic with a slightly aggressive, because 10 hours is still a lot for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
Right? You got to be organized to get that in. Right. But if you're doing that, you will be, in my opinion, in my experience, my coaching practice, that's enough training to move the needle, especially for a cross season.
Absolutely. When you think about cross races, right, most of them are between 30 to 60 minutes, a typical masters race between 40 and 45 minutes, give or take. So you don't need a ton of volume. And this is where, particularly in with cyclocross, focusing too much on volume and too much on CTL, and you're going to get discouraged because you're not going to see great numbers in that department. And having a great CTL and having a bunch of volume, particularly if you try to carry through the season, isn't necessarily going to make you faster.
Right.
So, and typically over time, right, it's that consistency piece, and then the other things you learn, whether it's about your equipment choices, your tires choice, your tire pressure, your technical skills, right? We're not just going to keep getting faster each year necessarily, but we can learn these other things and refine the warm-up routine and refine your clothing selection and your ability to observe, your ability to pre-ride the course. These are all facets that don't show up in a training program, but will definitely make you faster.
Yeah, for sure. So if we focus on the build phase, you talked about increasing the volume of intensity. So this is when we're aiming toward in a 6-zone system. We're looking at zone 3, which is tempo, zone 4, threshold, right? Are we aiming for that sort of intensity? Okay. And we're taking the volume up a little bit.
Right. So this is where you might start with, 3x10, a threshold, and you'd add, then go to 3x15 and 4x15 and 2x20 and 3x20 eventually. So you're spending more time at that. You're increasing your workload at that intensity, recognizing, again, you can only push so much into that 8 or 10 hours of total volume. So we want to do more quality work during that time.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking of some of the internet trolls and some of the audience members who will focus on 500 hours and ask some questions about that. So first, I'll say this: 500 hours isn't the magic. It's not the magical, but if we're just using 8 to 10 hours as a high end, that's what we're talking about. If you did 300 hours last year, try to do 350. Just try to tick it up a little bit.
Exactly.
Right. In the way of volume.
Yep.
And so this progressive overload that we're talking about in order to achieve, that's great. But then with CTL, what Jim was talking about is at some point, you're not going to get higher CTL. At some point, if you're riding 10 hours a week, if you're riding 12 hours a week, if you're riding 20 hours a week all the time, at some point your CTL will taper off. It will plateau, and that's fine. Completely appropriate.
Yeah, totally fine. And again, that's where I think getting hung up on the numbers, particularly with CTL, can be detrimental. Because if you focus particularly on CTL over the course of the cross season, even through the build up to the season, you're going to start getting discouraged. You're going to look at numbers. You're going to read too much. But in reality, if you're doing it right, it should come down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Before season.
Yeah.
Right.
Before the season. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. If you're doing it right, in my mind, if you're doing the training properly, your CTL should come down.
Yeah. Because you'll be faster. We'll talk about that either here soon or on the next episode. But you talked about, so we were talking about CTL. We're talking about building that up. I don't know. Is there any, I wouldn't even go there. I was going to ask you if there's any range that you would prescribe for a master's level racer off the top of your head.
Good question. I feel like it's, again, it always depends, right? But I feel like for a master's guy or gal, at the start of the season, you know, I would say as you start through this build phase, as you've been able to put in some consistent weeks, consistent months, as you get close to the cross season, they're typically between maybe 80 and 100. Yep. You know, again, ballpark. And again, this, I will always reinforce, for me, like you said, it's an art and a science. And I try to find that middle ground, and I try not to rely on numbers. Again, if you, in my mind, if you get too hung up on the number and you think, well, I'm not quite at 80 yet, there's no way I'm going to have a great season. It really doesn't, in my mind, doesn't matter, because if you've done the other work and you've maximized the time that you have available, you're going to do as best you can do with what you have. Could it be better? Probably, maybe, but maybe not. Maybe if you added more, it would become more of a distraction and you would recover less, and maybe your season wouldn't be productive. Or you would neglect something else in your life that would then have a detrimental effect on your recovery, your stress levels, all those other things. So it's a moving target.
Exactly. So we're still in the build phase. You said adding more. I would be remiss not to ask the question, but do you have your cyclocross athletes doing any run training, any specific running as we head into the cross?
Great question. So I would say, you know, as we're into that phase, the build phase, you know, May through August, you know, I think adding group rides is a great addition. If the athlete is interested in racing on the road, I think criteriums are fantastic. They're very similar in length and very similar in efforts. If you think about a 4-corner, a 6-corner criterium, all the accelerations, sprinting out of corners, coasting, max effort, recover, very similar. So I think that sets you up really well. Running, you know, and especially in the US, running in cyclocross is not a huge factor. Although depending on where you live and the weather in certain courses, it definitely is an element of the sport. So I usually have athletes start to do what I would say sort of jogging, 10 to 15 minutes. And sometimes it's a run, walk, maybe a minute on, minute off, just to get their legs used to load bearing, minimize some of the stress. But I think the most important part of running in cyclocross and in running and training is running with the bike. So figuring out a way to run where you're using your bike in a cyclocross-like manner. You know, I think it's fine just to run, but in a cyclocross race, you don't just run for 30 minutes straight, just like you don't ride at a steady pace for your race distance. So doing something where it involves, on your skills days, doing something that involves running with your bike. So either you have a small course you do where you can do a lap on, lap off, because just like the skills, you have to be doing it at speed under stress, right? If I just do a dismount and a remount on my bike, but I do it at a walking pace, easy. If I do it after I've just gone up a hill, I run, I remount, and then I have to sprint down through this next straightaway, that's very different. So I think it's important to put the running in with the bike and do it under stress.
Yeah. It's kind of like if you want to get better at shooting free throws, you shoot free throws.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I'd say a couple of things to that, like Jim talked about, is incorporating some jogging. I would imagine the reason you're doing that is just from a general movement standpoint, like just getting the body ready to also sprint with the bike. Cause that's a pretty dynamic thing. And if my juniors, I don't worry too much about it. My masters, I do worry a little bit about that because something gets pulled the first time they start sprinting.
Yeah. And we've all done it, right? Whether it's even the first time you go for a hike that's, you know, more than a mile long, you get back and think, well, I didn't run as cyclists, right? If we do anything for too long on our feet, we're sore. So that idea of just integrating a little bit of jogging, run, walk, whatever it is, gets your joints used to that impact, get your legs used to load bearing again before you progress to the skills at speed and, you know, jumping on and off the bike. Yeah,
exactly. And so you're incorporating some of that jogging as well as some of the skills stuff that you were describing already in the build phase, right?
Towards the end of it, I would definitely start to integrate that because, you know, some people, you know, they typically would spend the summer on their road bike or their mountain bike. So even that transition to the different bike, the geometry is a little bit different. The setup is a little bit different. So if you're spending 1 or 2 days a week on that bike, as you go through this build phase, it makes the transition so much easier as opposed to I just rode my mountain bike or my road bike all summer and then cross season starts in a month. So I'm going to start using that bike. And some athletes, I have some athletes that they have a road bike that they just prefer. They ride their cyclocross bike. They put road wheels on it or road tires on, and that's what they train on, which makes it even easier because then there's no transition to that setup.
Yep. And my last question on build phase before you mentioned incorporating group rides and some racing. Would you, two questions. One, would you incorporate any gravel racing if people are interested in that? Does that have good carryover? And then two, what kind of priority do you put on those training races?
Sure. I think for the most part, I would have those athletes, if cyclocross is their focus, right? If September to December is their focus, whatever they do during the summer is purely for fun. Most of them are competitive people, though. So when they get on the line, when they pin the number on, whatever it is, they want to do well. So it's going to be hard to ask them to not push themselves in those races. And I think that's okay. Gravel races are a great option. There's lots of them. The only maybe the hesitation with gravel racing is, the length of them, right? So their application to cyclocross is not the best, but doing a few isn't bad because that's your way to increase some volume. And I think racing is a great way to kind of distract you from the structure of training too. So group rides are the same thing. You go out, you ride with your friends, it's social. You're not just driven by your bike computer or driven by the numbers all the time. You tend to push yourself a little bit and you get some of that camaraderie and some of that friendly competition that happens over the course of those group rides and races. So I think gravel racing is great. Doing a lot of things like Unbound, 200 miles, something that's going to take, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 hours, one or two of those in the summer, no problem. But if you have a healthy diet of those, it's probably going to end up detracting from, your more cross specific. And that's where, again, if you could do some criteriums, those are perfect matches. Or shorter group rides, that hour and a half group ride where it's pretty aggressive right from the beginning. Those are awesome. Or if you have a weekly training race, perfect.
Yep, exactly. So a few more questions. I want to touch on the race phase real quick, but we're going to get pretty granular on that in the next episode. So I'd say just high level. You said the race phase is September through December. What sort of intensities are you doing there, and how much skill work are you doing kind of within that phase?
Right. So
is it like all just VO2 work, or are you incorporating endurance in there? And tell us a little bit how you'd structure that up.
Absolutely. At this point, and even towards the end of that build phase, you would be focused more on that high intensity, right? Mimicking the demands of the race. So high intensity intervals, whether that's VO2 work, anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes, or kind of the typical 30-30, 40-20s, really focusing on that because that's where you're going to make an impact in a cyclocross race. And this is where you're going to start to see your CTL tank a little bit, because at this point is where we're backing off on the volume. That volume is already established. You did that through the build phase, and that's in a good place. And typically that endurance component doesn't really fade the same way, right? So as long as you're doing a little bit of maintenance. So for the average person, during the week, it would be, probably if we can get in 2 good quality interval days, and then the rest of it during the week would be focused more on recovery, because if you're better recovered, those interval days are going to be better. And then maybe we do one longer ride on the weekend, and, longer might be 2 to 2.5 hours. And really, again, focusing on making sure that those interval days are super high quality.
Yep. Yeah. And this is where I'd say like a polarized sort of modality really shines through. If you want to think about a rhythm or a structure that you can kind of picture in your brain, where hard days are hard, easy days are easy. That's sort of the what I'd encourage people to think about in this phase. And then another thing that Jim said, like CTL is going to tank. And a lot of people, they freak out about that. But I really want people to hear that.
Yeah.
And the reason is you're doing so much high intensity work. And if you did everything that Jim talked about in that build phase, you put hay in the barn, as I like to say. Here's where the metrics and those numbers, it doesn't hold up to reality like it is. So if you come into cross season, it's like 85 for your CTL, and it comes down and all of a sudden you're in the 70s, maybe upper 60s, but you're hitting it and you're performing, you're on the podium. Right. Which would you rather?
Right. Right. Exactly. And what, again, this is where those metrics don't capture. So in a cyclocross race, right, you're full gas for 30 seconds, and then you're doing a technical descent for 15 seconds where there's zero power.
Yes.
So power goes to zero. And then you're off the bike running for 10 or 15 seconds. So again, zero power. So when you get done, it doesn't feel like you did only, 180 watts for 45 minutes, right?
Yeah. Or, 62 TSS or whatever.
Right. So that's where, again, it's important to remember what it feels like and what you're actually doing and not get too hung up on the numbers. And just be at peace with the fact that CTL is going to come down. It'll come back up when you get back into that base and build phase the following year, but focus more on the results and the race specific work that you need to do to be successful.
Exactly. So final question, Jim, is just kind of on managing motivation and freshness. We spoke about how a build phase or a base or a build phase is pretty motivating when days are getting longer and you got a little bit more sunlight, so you're building that up. But as we head into that September, October time period, now we're entering in a race season where the days are getting shorter. Your roadie friends and your gravel friends are like, it's holiday time. They take their transit. How do you help your cyclocross racers stay motivated and fresh in this time period when it's go time for them? They have to perform, and some of their cohorts may be letting their hair down a little bit.
Right. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. It can be very tough if that's where the bulk of your sort of contemporaries are. Those are the people you've been riding with through the summer. They're shutting it down while you're ramping it up. I think the big piece of it is, for me, is when you look at that cyclocross season, especially in the US, right, you're talking about September to December, right? So 3 months, baby. It may be a little bit more depending on when your season starts. It's not that long. So keeping them motivated, hopefully they see that, hey, if we, in a couple of months, you'll have 3 races left. So realizing that the season is short, and they've worked all through this, and you may need to take a little bit of a break, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in terms of, looking at the season, what races you're going to do, when are there times to take breaks, just to make sure they stay fresh and it doesn't become so all consuming. Because even though it's a short season, it's also very intense. And a lot of times there aren't a lot of extra races to do. So if you have an off weekend or you have a weekend that doesn't go well, it puts more stress on the following weekend. But I think a lot of it is, each individual athlete will be different on how they're motivated and what their drive is. But, listening to your athletes, talking to your athletes, and keeping them focused on what their goals were for the season, right? Was it a series? Was it the national championships? Was it to win a particular race? And make sure those goals help shape, what you're doing, and then also help shape their motivation. And maybe you've already planned it out with their season of, hey, listen, it's going to be super intense between, September 7th and October 21st. And then typically there's a little bit of a break, maybe, where there's a couple weekends off. Let's look to that. That's going to be our piece to kind of take a step back. We have Thanksgiving usually in the middle of that too for, the US riders, where we automatically get a break. Rarely is there a race weekend on Thanksgiving. So there's already some mini breaks worked in there, and I think talking through that whole season, what it's going to look like, where those breaks are going to come. So then the athletes can anticipate them. And it doesn't seem like a never ending, push all the way to nationals, because there are breaks already in there naturally with the schedule and also where you built the training.
Yeah. And that's where just good planning comes into place, good planning and communication. And I'll include on that, like we just, with some of the juniors I work with, we had a couple Zooms, right, where we just had the team calendar on there. And we're just like going through the priority of racing, what would be good, and it's just like getting into that planning time period. But I think to that end is a mid-season break, kind of during that the base build, like taking a summer break.
Right.
I think that also helps in keeping the stoke high once we hit into cross season. And then my other thing I tell my athletes is, fast in December means patience in September. You don't have to be peaked and tapered in September when cross season starts, even though everybody wants to.
Right.
So you want to build fitness and performance through cross season, because it's fast and furious. There's not a lot of breaks, like you said. And oftentimes if you do it right, which we'll talk about on the next podcast, is you actually get faster over those 3 or 4 months leading into nationals.
Right. That's the goal.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Jimmy, now that cross is no longer coming, it's here.
Hashtag cross is here, man. Cross is never gone, really.
That's true. That's true. So cross is never gone, folks. To our audience member Peter for queuing up that question, thank you. That's an awesome topic. In fact, you inspired 2 episodes. So for everyone, be sure to come back next week to talk or to listen to Jim and I talk about cyclocross specifically during season as we talk about race recover and how to build fitness and performance throughout a grindy season. So Jim, thanks for joining us today on the Time Crunch Cyclist podcast, and we'll see you next week.
All right. Love it. Thanks, guys.